Two opposition parties are demanding an emergency meeting on the prison conditions of convicted murderers Paul Bernardo and Luka Magnotta. The calls were prompted by Conservative MP Frank Caputo. He visited the La Casa medium security prison last month, where both men are incarcerated. Caputo says he was shocked by what he saw.
I walked outside and I had a look and I said, "What's that? Looks like a hockey rink." It was. Inmates can go and they can get skates and they can play hockey. There are hockey nets and everything.
There are hockey nets and everything, but satellite images of the prison from 2014 show that under the Conservative government there was already a rink on site at that time. Okay, we've talked about this issue before. We're going to talk about it again with the Power Panel. Cameron Ahmad is a former head of communications to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. James Moore is a former Conservative cabinet minister. Andrew Thompson is a former Saskatchewan NDP cabinet minister. And Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. James, help me with this. The Bernardo transfer became an issue last year. It kind of got litigated on his move from maximum to medium security. What do you think is at play here if this is a rink that goes all the way back and is not something that was purpose-built for the more notorious inmates at this prison?
Yeah, I mean, I gather this is from, a group of 5 members of Parliament doing a tour of the facility and recognizing some of the luxuries that are afforded not only to Paul Bernardo, but Luka Magnotta as well. And I think that the genesis of it all is that, I think our justice system and certainly the penal system fails the public interest when we hear the names Paul Bernardo and Luka Magnotta said publicly out loud again. I think what the general public thinks is, they're being given the privilege of being alive and being housed and being fed and being kept safe from the, frankly, natural selection of what would happen to them if they were in general population inside or outside of the prison. And they're being kept alive by sort of the decency and compassion of our society broadly. But we want to be able to know that we're being kept safe from them. We also want to think that they're not being given creature comforts that others in society don't have. So anytime the justice system, the result of our justice system results in their names being said out loud and us having to have a conversation about them, therefore igniting the passions, the wounds, the disappointments, and the sadness of the victims and the communities that they impacted because of their behavior, I think that's when our justice system fails. The fact that we're talking about these people again and again is a sign that our system has failed. I don't think this is sort of exploitative, anti-criminal, populist politics. I think a group of members of Parliament went to a facility, looked around and said, this is better than it should be for a guy who's as bad as they come.
Cameron, what are your thoughts on this? Because you hear from Corrections Services Canada and people who are experts on criminal justice, they say having some amenities makes for an easier to manage prison population, and it makes it safer for the people to work there and who are incarcerated there. What's your thoughts on how this is playing out?
Well, they're probably right. I mean, I'm not an expert on correctional services or on rehabilitation of inmates, but there are experts on them, and they have good reasons for doing that. I think the reason we are talking about it, though, James makes some good points, but ultimately this is a pretty cynical, performative outrage, piece of theater from the Conservative Party, something they've become really good at doing. And of course, no one wants to hear this. Nobody is going to sympathize with brutal killers, and nor should they. But I don't think that the Conservative Party is genuinely interested in talking about solutions to our justice system. And there are real problems. I mean, we know that there's an overrepresentation of certain populations in the prison system. There are online harms, something the government's been talking about and coming up with solutions for, both of which the Conservative Party never really is interested in talking about, and certainly doesn't support the things the government's doing to try and solve them. This is just a, sadly, I think, very effective tactic ploy for them to gin up anger and get people upset. And of course, people will rightly be upset about aspects of prisons that people are, offenders are able to benefit from. But there are much broader issues to talk about. And if they want to haul people to a committee and spend lots of hours talking about this is all just to generate more clips, farm more outrage, and get people angry on social media.
Andrew, is that your take? It's just rage farming, as Cameron says, or is there something more fundamental at play?
Well, to be honest, I think the Tories bungled it. The fact that Magnotta was moved in itself was a scandal. It is done in the same kind of conditions that we saw with Bernardo. A lot of secrecy, a lot of unclarity as to whether the minister had okayed this or not, was aware of it. That is the issue, is should he be housed in a maximum security prison, and what were the conditions that he was moved from that. Instead, they took it one step further into this stupidity about whether or not there's an abandoned hockey rink at this jail. And as a result, that's what people are talking about. Well, did this hockey rink exist when Stephen Harper was there? Apparently it did. Is it functional now? Who knows? And it's moved away from what was the major issue here, which are what are the conditions where these dangerous offenders, these really terrible prisoners, are being shifted from maximum to lower security prisons. And that, in that regard, this can't be seen as a success by the Tories because they've bungled it and now moved it on to something that seems manufactured. It seems almost secondary to what the real issue is here.
Shachi, how do you view it in terms of how people are responding to this? Because it has come down to this bit about the hockey rink to some degree, and as we learned last year, I believe it was, with the Bernardo transfer, the minister doesn't necessarily approve it. This is all done by the corrections system based on its own policies, right?
Right, so there's four things at play here. There is the process, there's the politics, there's the public opinion, and then there's the policy aspect of it. So the process is, as you just laid out, this is arm's length from politicians. This is a function of correction services. And in addition to what Andrew calls the bungling of the Conservatives on this, you can have an opinion one way or the other on that. I think he's right in that regard. They should have just focused on the specifics here as opposed to the extra floof of the hockey rink. There's also the issue of process. And who else bungled this? I would suggest it was Corrections Canada, the organization, because how could they not foresee, having been through everything that happened with Paul Bernardo last year, that Luka Magnotta, another notorious, violent, psychopathic, horrible killer, reducing him from a maximum to a medium security situation was not going to somehow, number one, come out, number two, blow up in their faces. So that's the process part. There's the public opinion part. Of course it's blowing up in their faces because the vast majority of Canadians look at offenders like these two men and others, the dead Clifford Olson, Robert Pickton, etc., and they want nothing, understandably, it's human nature, but a really miserable life on the inside for these people who have inflicted so much cruelty, so much harm, so much damage, not only to their victims, but to the families and to society in general. The politics comes in where politicians then say, aha, this shows a problem in terms of lapses in the justice system. You know, what we're missing is the policy question and the conversation that needs to be had at a broader level. What do Canadians want for seriously violent, terrible offenders, the worst of the worst offenders? Is there regulation or legislation that needs to be put into place that say people like this, regardless of what all the other bad people out there do, and they go from maximum to medium, and guess what, folks, even sometimes to minimum security penitentiaries that are even more lax and have even nicer things, you know, should that be stuff that our worst offenders just don't have access to? And instead of having a conversation on those grounds, instead we end up in this cycle of this really terrible bad guy is out, and this really terrible bad guy is out, and no one seems to be learning anything from this.
Right, and well, we did last year have a lot of conversations with the ability of Paul Bernardo to go to a minimum security. We talked to the experts on that, and people who worked in this. There's a zero chance of something like that happening. So that's a concern people have. I don't think it's a concern that will be realized. But James, you made the point that I guess the justice system has failed if we're talking about these guys, right? And I take your point on that, the notoriety of infamous killers. But we wouldn't be talking about it if it wasn't like a social media video with production and then, you know, the allegations of the Canadian press lying as they reported on it. It's the politics that has pushed this up to the surface, right? So it seems like this is going to be an enormous thing between now and the election. How do you have the conversation about it that it's not just rage farming about notorious killers?
Well, it'll be driven by facts is the thing that people should be comforted by. You know, there's going to be hearings before a parliamentary committee. You know, Frank Caputo from Kamloops is going to go before a parliamentary committee as a member of the committee and talk about what he saw. So will the Bloc MP and the other Conservative MPs. Mm-hmm. They'll bring witnesses before the committee. Facts will be laid on the table, and people can determine what they want to do with those facts and where we go from there. So, you know, I think a lid has been popped off of a conversation about correctional services in the country and whether or not not they're just and appropriate. The truth will be told about what that rank is or isn't, and when it was put in place, and when it was become decrepit or what have you. But this is how Parliament should work. We got 338 members of Parliament going up to 343 members of Parliament. They toured a facility that's paid for by taxpayers of Canada. And some members of Parliament didn't like what they saw. They're calling the appropriate people before a committee. Facts will be put out there. We'll debate the facts, and democracy goes on. This is how the system works. It's fine.
Cameron, do you think it's going to be fine? Do you think, because we know law and order is going to be a big part of the focus between now and the next election. Do you think this is headed on a good path with the way it's being framed right now?
I don't think it's headed on a good path. I mean, I think it's certainly valid for a parliamentary committee to look into it and for MPs to debate it and question bureaucrats for decisions that were made, which, as has been mentioned, should remain arm's length, and we should be very careful about the over-politicization of our justice system or our corrections institutions and what types of decisions politicians make versus officials who are experts who are supposed to be making these decisions. I don't think we want to be in a society where politicians have the full control over where specific offenders or inmates are sent and what types of conditions that they face. But of course, that can all be discussed in a committee setting too. I just hope it doesn't become just another opportunity for the Conservative Party to try and turn this into a political game, which is what they do with these committees, and certainly what I think they're doing with the law and order issue writ large. It really looks like that's how they're trying to build this whole thing up to, and I think the government has an opportunity to turn it back on them. Like I said earlier, if the Conservative Party is so concerned about protecting victims and making the country fairer and safer for everybody, there are some serious issues that are much broader than the specific conditions of two horrible, sadistic murderers that affect lots of people, that affect victims and survivors, like I mentioned, on social media and in many other ways across society, ways in which the government has tried to address these problems that have been lauded by many experts, and the Conservative Party has chosen to say, we're not interested. We're going to oppose everything the government does and just paint them all as soft on crime. Right. So I think there is some opportunity for the government to go after them on this issue.
Okay, Andrew,
well, let's have the next election.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just say if we have the next election on criminal justice reform, I don't imagine the Liberals will come back with official party status in the Parliament of Canada, given the way things are. I mean, it's one thing to say Conservatives have it wrong, and that's a fair debate, but it's another thing to say, Liberals have an approach. Liberals have been in office now for going on they're now their ninth year, 3 parliaments, 2 of them effectively majority parliaments, multiple attorneys general. You've had, almost a decade to do whatever it is that you want with the justice system. At the end of it, if the Conservatives are ahead in the polls 4-1 when it comes to who do you trust more on justice issues, the Liberals have had their opportunity to govern on the subject matter, and the public knows what they think of them.
So this is really what the big question, I think, is that it plays into this argument that, exactly as Cameron has said, well, there's nothing we can do. I mean, the Liberals can't do anything because it's all left up to the bureaucrats. And people go, well, that just doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound like why we have a government. There's no sense sending a party into Parliament that doesn't actually want to govern. And I think that is what plays into the strength of the Conservative argument right now, which is there's just so many things where it doesn't look like this government can do anything, and people want change. And so all of it, whether you agree with the hockey rink or whether you agree with their position on criminal justice, I think what people want to know is that the government actually does feel it can do things, does understand what public outrage is on these issues, or at least where public opinion is, and are prepared to act on it. If they aren't, it feeds into this notion that, well, whatever the issue is, it's just time for a change.
Okay, Shachi, quick final word on that, and then we're going to switch topics.
Well, don't look to or expect the Conservatives to ease up on this particular issue, because there are 2 issues, and I've talked about this before, that are really almost immune to ideology. One of those issues is economic issues. We've seen the way past Liberal voters have simply walked away, at least for now, from the Liberal Party, and are situating themselves with the Conservatives when it comes to home economics, personal financial situation, people just feeling like they can't get ahead. The other issue is crime, justice, and public safety. You do not have to be an ideologue to feel unsafe in your city. You do not have to be an ideologue to feel outraged around these issues. And the reason we're not going to see it go away is because for Conservatives, this is effective and low-hanging fruit. So stay tuned for more stories like this.